there's still a decent number of brand new Mark 7.5 GTIs available throughout the nation, as well as even more used examples out there. So with the Mark 8 GTI slated to hit the States pretty soon, should you still be getting or considering a Mark 7 GTI? This is a 2021 Volkswagen Golf GTI, which makes it the Mark 7.5 in VW terms. And it's the SE trim, which is the middle trim in between the S and the Autobahn. And it starts life at just over $32,000 and is $35,000 out the door as equipped with delivery. The SE trim comes standard with adaptive LED headlights, blind spot monitoring, leather seats, and a sunroof. Otherwise, it comes with a pretty solid infotainment system. It's touchscreen based and has Apple CarPlay functionality. It also comes with an acceptable audio system standard, and all GTIs come with the same lovely power plant. The SE trim also comes with keyless access as well as heated seats, but this particular car has the optional and well-respected DSG 7-speed dual clutch transmission. Obviously, 6-speed manual is always the right answer, right? No, but it does, all GTIs actually come standard with a manual. So not only optional, but actually standard, and you'd have to then pay extra, $800 extra, regardless of trim level, to get an automatic, which again is a fantastic 7-speed dual clutch transmission. But this does have all seasons. They are 18 inches in diameter and 225 section rubber on all four corners. The 18-inch wheels themselves are black and they look pretty cool, but as I always say, I mean, at least they're not run flats, but the fact that they're all seasons is a weak point, and throwing some proper summer tires, summies on this car would make a pretty sizable difference. The Golf GTI is powered by a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine producing 228 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. All GTIs are front-wheel drive, and with this particular car's dual clutch transmission, which includes launch control, 60 miles an hour can be reached in the mid to high 5-second range, which is pretty respectable for a hot hatch. But the real strength of the GTI comes from the practicality and German refinement that you get. Now let's get this Mark 7.5 onto the road and discuss more. So setting off here in the GTI, I currently have the car in its sport driving mode. There's also an eco driving mode, a normal driving mode, and a custom mode, which lets you individualize certain parameters, of which there were more than I was expecting. First, you can adjust the engine sound, and there's a ridiculous 4 different options. You have eco, comfort, a redundant normal, and then I guess the expected sport. You then have 2 drivetrain settings, which I believe dictates your throttle mapping. Then you have steering. You have normal and sport steering, sport being heavier, normal being a bit lighter. And lastly, you can put the front differential into normal or sport mode. In sport mode, it more quickly and more aggressively will lock up the front diff and send power to the outer wheel to aid in faster and more composed cornering. It's crazy how much technology these cars are packing in nowadays. I actually used to have a GTI. It was my very first car, and it wasn't a Mark 7.5 or even a Mark 7, it was a Mark 6. And in that car, the only sort of driving mode or sport mode you had was by putting the transmission, pulling it into sport mode, where it has more aggressive shift points and holds gears longer. The same thing is still true of this DSG, the same DSG effectively. That was a 6-speed, this is a 7. But yeah, the same thing is still true now, but on top of it, you have all of the other parameters I mentioned, all the other driving modes I mentioned. So the baseline that I'm trying to establish here is that there seems to have been a pretty substantial technological leap between the Mark 6 and the Mark 7, certainly this kind of last model year Mark 7.5. And I don't know if there's going to be quite as substantial of a leap moving into the Mark 8. Obviously, that will be determined once they are here in the States and we can drive them and really compare them directly to this Mark 7 and Mark 7.5. Now that we've discussed all of that, let's get back to how this car drives. So in sport mode, this car can kind of hold its own on a nice back road. One of the first things I noticed is when you're driving pretty aggressively, that front diff locks up a little faster than I was expecting. It's a little bit reassuring to know the car is kind of sending power to the other corner, helping you power through a turn. And again, it's just another sign of advancement within the car industry. Under load, I can't really tell a huge difference between sport and normal steering, but here driving slow in traffic-like situations, it's definitely a bit heavier in sport. Overall, I would say it's pretty light steering. It's neither good nor bad. I really enjoy heavy steering, and that's what you find in your typical BMWs. In the Mini Coopers, when you put them into sport mode, the steering really gets nice and heavy, and I know some people can't stand that. For me, it's like my dream. So this is a little bit lighter than I'm used to, but it's also fairly direct steering and better than I was expecting at the same time overall. So the Mark 7 here clearly puts power down better than the Mark 6, and that's true both in a straight line where it doesn't spin out and break traction as easily, as well as in the turns where it has less of a juddering feeling in the steering and essentially less torque steer. So I think that front diff is working wonders here and there. And it's definitely, again, another nice step up from the Mark 6 into these Mark 7s, but it makes me think, how much of improvement is there left to be made with the Mark 8? You do have this really noticeable lag. I think it's like a dual clutch thing where if you're at a complete standstill without launch control and you just punch it, it's like it needs to build up torque before it can really go. I think I got a clip of it, so I'll demonstrate that here. Now, all of this to me is a really good sign that the Mark 8 is gonna be even better. I don't know how much room exactly there is for improvement, but there will probably be only continued improvement, and all of these newer GTIs to me are very impressive compared to the Mark 5s and Mark 6s that I was accustomed to up until this point. So moving on to the looks, this is a bit more subjective, of course, and the one caveat, the one disclaimer, I'm not gonna make any crazy claims about the Mark 8 until I've seen one in person, which I've yet to, but I do think that this Mark 7, especially the Mark 7.5 that we're in, is a little bit cleaner looking, and I feel like the Mark 8 is creeping more towards crossover and more towards, you know, funky, almost like EV design language. But again, I'm gonna hold off my final thoughts until I see one in person, and I know that there's things like the Club Sport GTIs that look a lot cleaner because they get rid of that terrible fog light design. But for this car in particular, you do get, as I mentioned earlier, those adaptive LEDs, which look really nice, and they have a really cool DRL signature. Along with that DRL signature, they have a red accent, which extends all the way through, or from within the headlight housings on either side, through the front grille. Now that's a GTI specific design element, obviously, because red is the GTI color, while blue is the R color. You get a somewhat aggressive, yet mostly subtle lower front fascia. The side profile is also classic hot hatch, nothing too crazy to stand out aside from the wheels. And then out rear is where things are the most simple, I would say. You have LED tail lights, you have the VW badge, which triples as the badge, a latch for the rear tailgate, as well as a housing for the rear view camera. And other than that, you have a rear diffuser, which has a similar honeycomb design element that matches the front grille, and pretty massive exhaust pipes on either side. They're real, it's dope. What's not so dope is the exhaust sound, at least at a standstill, where there's a soft limiter and it holds the revs at under 4K. I'll put a clip in here, you guys can listen. But yeah, so standstill, at idle, the exhaust is not fantastic. Under load, it's decent for a four-banger. But the exhaust tips do look very nice, and they're like a really, I don't know, they're just one little design element that these days, obviously EVs don't even have it all, but a lot of brands are moving towards fake exhaust tip finishers, and I like seeing real exhaust tips still in a sportier car. Before we shift to the interior, I did want to really quickly mention that the 2015 through 2017 GTIs are the standard Mark 7, the pre-facelift, and the 2018 through 2021 are the Mark 7.5 facelifts, just for reference for those of you who are not aware. But moving on to the interior, it feels very familiar to me. I think it is indeed very similar to the same interior in the Mark 6, and that's a good thing. It's like an evolution rather than a revolution. They're building on a good thing instead of completely changing it, and that's because they've been doing pretty good interiors for a while. So you notice a lot of similar trim placement and style to older GTIs, and the Mark 8 is actually It is a revolution, and there are a lot of screens, and I don't know, it's in video and in photo, it seems tacky to me. Again, I'm gonna reserve any final judgment until I see it in person, but this interior feels like a nice, elegant balance. And I keep using that word because I feel like the entire design language of the Mark 7.5 is really elegant compared to a slightly over-the-top design language within the Mark 8. So while the interior feels familiar, you get a substantial upgrade here in the sense of infotainment. What's not so improved is the gauge cluster, and I know that the Mark 7.5 Golf R's got a really nice, if not slightly cluttered, digital cluster, but here in the US at least, all GTIs still come with analog gauges. Now, I like analog gauges in theory, and I actually miss them in a lot of newer cars, but that central little screen you get in between the gauges does feel outdated now. It gives you for instance, what I have it set on now is a digital speed readout, the same thing you could do all the way back to the Mark 5 GTI. But what bothers me the most is your gear readout is in the top right corner in a tiny font, and when you're in manual mode, and if you're mobbing, right, if you're driving more spirited, it's distracting to have to like zone in on that little top right corner of the screen to see what gear you're in. I feel like most cars these days can give you a slightly larger or more centralized readout there. Otherwise, the steering wheel itself is a nice leather-wrapped John, and it's a nice thing to look at. It has deviated red stitching and all the little things to make it feel a bit sportier and special. Unfortunately, with this DSG, it has a pretty crappy set of paddle shifters, almost as bad as the ones you'd find in a Mini Cooper. They're just not even nice to touch. They're angled very weirdly, and it's a weak point, as is this steering column itself, which dips super low down in all Golfs for some reason. I don't know why that is, and it was a prevalent problem in the Mark 6s, I believe in the Mark 5 also. I just don't know why VW designs it this way, where your knee is constantly banging into it. At least at my height, and at least the way I sit, it's very noticeable and very annoying. But moving on from the bad to the good, I gotta say these seats are fantastic. I used to have the tartan cloth trim on my seats, which is still available in the base GTIs, and I really like it. I mean, it's definitely a little bit gimmicky, but it has a lot of character, and it even has practicality in the sense, or functionality in the sense of being a bit cooler, staying cooler than these leather seats. This looks a bit more premium, of course, and is leather, so it feels nicer, whatever. I usually like leather, so I shouldn't be all coy there, but honestly, the seats have so much lateral support. Of course, up here in the bolsters, which are pretty aggressive, certainly more aggressive than they look, but more importantly, and the most noticeable factor of these seats is the lateral thigh support. I don't think I've sat in a seat, at least not a standard seat, in a car under $100,000 in recent years that's this good when it comes to lateral support. Comfortability is also pretty high, and overall, sitting here in the Golf, any Golf, but in the GTI in particular, it's just a nice place to be. The overall ergonomics are pretty good aside from the steering column, and the seats only aid in that. And when you're driving fast, which I'm guessing most people with GTIs will at least occasionally do, you really feel snug and secure in these seats. And that's not true of a lot of other cars, often more expensive sporty cars. Another highlight of this interior is the overall space, the interior volume. You have pretty good rear leg room. I think two of me could pretty easily fit. I'm about 6'2", could easily fit behind myself. Probably not a fifth one, but this is still a pretty compact car with a pretty small footprint. And the trunk space is also pretty solid. You can obviously fold those rear seats down to have a large open cargo area, similar to a crossover or a small SUV, which is really what helps hatchbacks stand out compared to sedans. But overall, this car oozes practicality right along with the refinement and sportiness of its character. Now let's wrap the interior up with a little tall boy action. So it's time for the tall boy test. Let's see if the GTI can hang. All right, so circling back to the driving experience, this is classic hot hatch, and what I mean is it brings the boy racer out in you. This car doesn't scare you. It, if anything, eggs you on to drive hard. Definitely understeers a little bit because it's still front wheel drive and this diff can only do so much. I think, obviously, as I've already mentioned and touched on, the all-season tires are doing no favors to this car, or doing no favors for this car. But even despite that, there's just something fun about driving a GTI. You can get this car closer to its limits, closer to 10 tenths, because of its lower power output. And I'm finding myself needing to remember to be a civilized adult driver and not a little kid, because it's just too much fun to punch the GTI in and out of turns. And I mean, yeah, it's just something special about driving a little tiny hot hatch. The Autobahn tuned suspension, as VW calls it, is definitely a bit harsh, or harsher than some would like. And I think if you've made it this far in the video and are not into spirited driving but still considering a GTI, then that's a perfect use case for someone who should consider the Autobahn trim, where you get adaptive suspension. You can choose to maybe put it into comfort when you're just trying to drive around and not feel every single bump, but you do feel a lot of bumps, and it aids in the car staying a little bit more flat through the corners, but can be intimidating to those who want to maybe comfortably cruise around. It's not terrible. I'm not trying to say that the suspension in the GTI is brutally harsh, but it edges on harsh more than it does on comfortable. Again, that's great news for the boy racers out there, but not as good of news for a mature and calm adult driver who doesn't want to take corners at 8 tenths on public roads, which I don't condone at all. Don't do that. I don't condone it. So yeah, stiff suspension mixed with an aggressive front diff with a solid steering rack, on top of pretty good interior tech and good build quality. All of that on top of the fact that this car has a familiar and in many cases beloved design language and style, does make the Mark 7 GTI feel like a modern product, and it feels like something that would leave most people very satisfied in 2021 and beyond. So does that make it a good buy? Well, it depends. I think if you're considering a GTI because it's a solid value proposition, then I would go ahead and still pick one up, either new with a nice discount or a nice condition, clean, used one. But if you're looking at the GTI like it's an extremely attainable car for you, and you're maybe gonna get a fully loaded one, then I'd probably hold off and at least see what the Mark 8 has to offer come later this year, because it most likely will be an improved vehicle, at least dynamically speaking, and I would say subjectively regarding the tech and design elements of the interior. Either way, the GTI still impresses and continues to go down as a do-it-all, sensible and sporty choice that would leave just about anybody happy. I'm with it. If you guys enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. New videos are dropping every single week. Comment down below, let me know what you're trying to see. I'll do my best to make it happen. And as always, this is Rio. Peace.